So let's talk through the strengths and weaknesses of fielding every single unit in Codex Astra Militarum. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Guard, and in this video I thought we'd continue in the Strengths and Weaknesses series on the channel, and do a brief focused overview of every single unit in the Imperial Guard Codex. Overall, the Guard aren't having too bad a time of it in current Warhammer 40k, though I would say that some units are definitely a lot more standout than others, so it's going to be fun to talk about what's good and why. We'll go through Codex Astra Militarum section by section, talk about each unit and how much it costs to field them, some of their biggest strengths and weaknesses over other units in game, and a slightly arbitrary score out of 10 for how strong I'd rate them competitively at the moment. Loads to talk about, so let's jump straight in. First up, we've got the troops of the Guard, and starting out we've got the basic infantry squad, 65 points for a unit of 10 guys, though I guess more often it's going to be 8 guys plus a heavy weapon team. Guard infantry in general I think do have some pretty nice advantages. Their objectives secured, so pretty handy for holding points. They're fairly cheap and expendable with a low points cost per model, and though their damage output individually is kind of underwhelming, they have some really nice synergies, particularly orders like Take Aim for +1 to hit and extra AP. They're core for rerolls, and they can use that finial standard from the command squad. Infantry in general are pretty nice for boots on the ground as well. If you've got a fair few of them, you're almost going to guarantee scoring that objective fairly high. In the Codex you can fill the infantry squad specifically, or the other flavours of infantry that are named to one regiment, and the advantage of the standard one is to get a heavy weapon, maybe for a bit of objective camping. Having a long-range las cannon or ignores line of sight mortar are both pretty handy. As for downsides, their damage output isn't enormous even with buffs. I'd say their durability is okay, but not standout at 65 points per unit. Anything with strength 4 and a little bit of AP really will go through them quick, and they are reliant on buffs to get the most out of them, things like orders and the command structure. For the infantry squad specifically, I'd rate them an 8 out of 10, pretty strong and usable, but realistically outcompeted by Cadian shock troops, so you're more likely to see Cadians in most lists than these. Speaking of which, Cadian shock troops are the regiment-specific datasheet for 65 points. You can field them in any guard army now though, and for the most part they seem to be the preferred troops choice competitively. They've got the advantages of the infantry squad with a few really nice benefits. 2 special weapons rather than a heavy weapon is kind of useful for any sort of squad advancing. The Cadian keyword allows a couple of stratagems, including their rather nice transhuman physiology style one, only wounded on 4s. They natively get more hits with their las weapons, exploding 6s to hit with those, and the sergeant's got a rather nice gun as well with a drum-fed auto gun, making it a rapid-fire 2 strength 3 weapon. Overall, between all of those advantages, I'd generally just rate the Cadian shock troops as an infantry squad, but overall better. They still have similar kind of downsides, but extra shooting, better stratagems, double special weapons and an auto gun quite easily outweighs the advantage of taking a single heavy weapon. Definitely a very competitive guard unit and kind of necessary to win games I think. I'd rank them a 9 out of 10. Next up, for variant infantry squads, we've got the Death Corps of Krieg one. These ones are a decent amount more expensive, starting at 75 or 80 if you take the med pack. Again, basically the same unit as the infantry squad with a few different side grades. The main innate bonus that you get in the squad is they tend to be quite tough. You can't wound them on 2s, meaning that they're tougher against things that are strength 6 or better. They get the option of that medipack to ignore a single failed save each turn, plus the option to resurrect some guys with a stratagem. Plus they do have some interesting options with the special weapons as well. You can technically take 3 special weapons, though you have to choose whether or not you want to take the Voxcaster. The main downside to all that, of course, is that they are a bit more expensive and will just generally do less damage than the Cadian shock troops, and the durability is maybe a bit of a side grade as well, again due to being significantly more expensive. Overall, I do still think they're pretty solid though, but perhaps slightly from this datasheet a little bit subpar to the cheaper infantry. I'd rank them a 7 out of 10 overall. Finally, for the troop section, we have the Kazachan Jungle Fighters. These guys really lost out hard in the new codex, 70 points for a squad of them, but for some reason almost directly worse than either the standard infantry squad or the Cadians. I guess their biggest draws are doubling up on flamers, a tiny melee buff, a Kazachan keyword to help with the vicious trap stratagem, and some synergy with Sergeant Harker if you wanted to field him. There really are a lot of downsides to them though. They cost more than the Cadians at 5 points more, and arguably do less. You can't take the exciting special weapons like plasma guns or melter guns to actually help you out against hard targets. Generally guard do anti-infantry fairly well with las guns already. The melee buff is really poor to be honest. Exploding 6s to hit just doesn't really cut it when you're only attacking with 1 strength 3 attack normally anyway, and even their stratagem access I'd say is less helpful than the Cadian one. At the very least I think that these guys should have cost the same as Cadians, not 5 points more. Overall, I've chosen to rank them a 4 out of 10, pretty heavily outclassed by the other troops, though realistically I don't think they're going to hold your army back by enormous amounts by fielding a squad or two. Next up, as its guard, I thought we'd jump into the heavy support section, and first up we have the venerable Lehman Russ. 155 points per model usually, though I think it's usually worth paying the extra 10 points for a pair of heavy bolter sponsons at least. The Lehman Russes have done very well out of the Codex update, and are arguably perhaps one of the most efficient damage dealers overall from the book, certainly at their range and mobility. For the choice of turret weapons, I'd perhaps rate the Executioner Plasma Cannon and Vanquisher Cannon as perhaps the most interesting standard ones. The Executioner really just chew through most things, and the mortal wounds aren't the biggest downside. The Vanquisher punches through invuls, which is really big, and perhaps Gatekeeper is interesting as well on tank commanders, though I guess we'll get to them later. From there, heavy bolter sponsons are pretty solid now that Armour of Contempt went away, particularly in Born Soldiers for auto-wounding on 6s. Heavy flamers are also very usable if you're running more full tank companies and you need some to be a bit aggressive, and it is actually a bit more useful to use them on the front lines than it used to be. Now the turret weapon rule still allows them to fire when they're locked up, they don't need to cringe away from the enemy army as much as they used to. Beyond that, you can field them in squadrons, so you can have 9 in a heavy support section and not really too much trouble. They've got good stratagems including -1 damage if they need it, plus smoke launchers and the option to fire the turret on death. And they've got really nice flexibility with the tank orders as well, often just going to be getting more damage, but more speed or objective secured could both be really handy in the right situation. Overall, the Lehman Russ is one of the most efficient data sheets in the Guard Codex. I'm going to give it the full 10 out of 10 for my ranking here. I guess in terms of weaknesses, it's a little bit less indomitable following the loss of Armour of Contempt, perhaps a bit more skewed to more damage and speed and less durability. And in an ideal world, you still don't really want them to wind up in combat as well, as that could give you tricky choices between falling back and allowing the rest of your army to shoot the unit that tags you in melee. Still though, certainly a generally strong tank, very strong damage output, relatively tough, and even reasonable speed compared with infantry moving 10 inches. Nice to see the Russes doing well. Moving on, and we've got the Lehman Russ's bigger brother, the Rogel Dawn. This big and extremely chunky tank is 250 points base, does really quite a lot of the similar things that the Lehman Russ does, and maybe is kind of similar in terms of numbers, with a big toughness 9 to protect it, but less wounds for the points. Broadly speaking, I'd say the damage output of its guns are pretty equivalent, though I would say that maybe the Rogel Dawn is perhaps a little bit less helpful in terms of the way that they're set up. It comes with some weapons that you kind of want to get into 24 inches with, which maybe just makes it a little bit less long range and flexible overall. Being a big chunky unit all of its own though does have advantages. Anything that just affects one unit is going to be pretty efficient on this guy. Things like the tank ace buffs like the ignore cover one, or any stratagems like smoke launchers that don't cost more than 1 CP. Games Workshop did budget it a bit higher though for a stratagem like the -1 damage one where you have to pay 3 CP rather than the Russ's 2, which is a bit of a downside. The tank ace trait that allows you to effectively order itself is really quite a good one as well. It can mean that a Rogel Dawn could function as a bit of a pseudo tank commander if you wanted, plus the way that the rules are written at the moment you can still order yourself while doing that. Overall, I think it definitely has advantages, but maybe feels like maybe one that you'd want 1 or 2 of in the battle line, when weapons on the Russes perhaps seem just a bit more general purpose, like the Executioner or that scary invul punching Vanquisher. Maybe just a bit clunkier and harder to use overall. Plus it's got a fairly enormous profile compared with the Russ, making it a lot harder to hide. Overall I'd rate it an 8 out of 10, really not far behind the Lehman Russes if they did get nerfed or something. At the moment though I'd rate it a bit more niche when compared directly to them. The two really do feel like units that are competing for the same battlefield role. Moving on, we've got the Hydra, an 110 points in theory anti-air vehicle, but with the new rules it is rather effective against most things. A turret weapon keyword on the main autocannons, allowing it to hit you on 3s with 8 strength 7, AP 2 and damage 2 shots, a fairly good generalist profile. Again on raw numbers for damage and defense, when you've waited for the points cost, the Hydra is kind of similar to the Russes. Plus if the enemy does happen to be using any flyers, which admittedly are a bit less popular now, it really is bad news for them on the table, basically getting double damage against them, and the ability to intercept them when they come onto the board, fairly brutal in Arcs of Omen when they must start in reserve. Overall, if you want another battle tank style threat and you don't have quite enough points for a Ross, the Hydra isn't too bad. Certainly if aircraft were any sort of common part of the meta, then the Hydra will be fairly excellent I think. With the recent nerfs to making aircraft start off the board though, they aren't going to be taken anywhere near as much, making the Hydra a bit more niche maybe. Compared with Russes, it isn't quite as easy to cram into heavy support slots as well. You can't squadron them, which means it might be competing with things like Russes and mortars. Overall I'd rate it an 8 out of 10 though, a solid competitive guard unit, though maybe a little bit inferior to the Russ. Let's talk some long-range bombardment options now, and next up we have the Death Strike, 160 points for cruise missile of doom, perhaps most commonly used to exert board control and make the enemy move where you want to with that scary God Spear missile, where you've got the potential for anywhere between 8 and 16 mortal wounds on each unit that it hits. It is pretty threatening just to be able to plop down that marker in the middle of an enemy castle and have all their units scurry for cover unless they want to take massive damage, or potentially make things a bit irritating for them to hold objectives and scare out enemy units that were hiding behind terrain. As well as the scary God Spear, you do have the option of the Vortex missile or the big dispersed plasma one if it makes more sense in the matchup that you're playing. And at least in theory, there are some tricks that you could use to make enemies get more reliably hit by it, things like the psychic power to debuff movement, or a tank order that can suppress movement further. Then if you do actually ever wind up firing the missile, then it can just be a cheap expendable nuisance unit, park it on objectives or make nuisance charges. Anything else it does is a bonus. As for downsides, I think in reality it's kind of hard to ever really guarantee any damage that might come out of this. Your opponent might just have good mobility and just move away all game long. Even if you do trigger it, it's a bit depressing that you do still have the chance to roll a 1 and do literally nothing to any one unit with it. Could be a bit depressing for the God Spear if you desperately need just one unit squashed and it can't even do that. The God Spear missile is perhaps deliberately not quite big enough to cover the entire radius of an objective marker in 40k as well, which means that you can't just guarantee scare an enemy unit off it. Sometimes though, it might be able to do that practically due to nearby terrain and enemy base sizes though. Sometimes it might be possible to deny an objective in practice, even if the theory would say you can't. Finally, I would say that there's the chance of the opponent just accepting any damage that you get out of the Death Strike, just accepting that you're going to hit them with a big missile on one of their expendable units. Sure, you might kill 80 or 100 points worth of models, but that might be a trade that they're willing to take if it basically is the entire damage output of an 160 point model of yours. Overall though, definitely has its uses to scare enemy units away from one bit of the board. I'd rank it an 8 out of 10, definitely can be playable in competitive lists. Into the other artillery, and first up we have the Wyvern, 120 points for the anti-infantry artillery piece. This one spams out 46 strength 5 AP-1 shots, and I feel like it's in direct competition with the mortars, who do kinda similar with take aim, but get significantly more damage than the Wyvern does for the points. The Wyvern's main selling points are that it's a lot more mobile, and it's a fair bit tougher than the mortars, having an armoured hull. It does pack a heavy bolter as well, which isn't nothing. In general though, this really isn't enough to outweigh the big damage deficit that it has compared with them, and durability perhaps doesn't matter that much either if you're aiming to hide the unit, so ideally your opponent can't shoot them anyway. I think either the Wyvern would need to be a bit more threatening, maybe having a bit more AP or something like that. At the moment it's just not very general purpose, and if you're going premium artillery piece, you probably want to go Manticore, Basilisk or Field Ordnance, and if you're going for anti-infantry, you'd probably want to go for mortars. It's not unusable, but it just seems a bit outclassed both ways that you look at it. I've chosen to rank it a 5 out of 10 here. Next up, we've got the Basilisk, 140 points per model, with a big indirect fire big gun, d6 plus 3 shots, at strength 10, AP 3, and damage 2. In general, with guard artillery, it is kind of cost at a premium. The damage output isn't enormous, say, compared with Ross's, but it does have the advantage of being able to put some big damage exactly where you need it on the board, and that can have a value over and above the points of models that you destroy. You can make the artillery better with things like Master of Ordnance or Expert Bombardiers if you're using that regiment, and for the Basilisk itself, when compared with the Manticore, it's perhaps a bit better against 2-wound infantry like Space Marines, and it can fire all 5 turns, unlike the Manticore which only has 4 rockets. In general though, the numbers just don't really add up all that well for the standard Basilisk. For the most part, the Manticore does seem to have a much higher damage output against a lot of hard targets, and the Field Ordnance probably does better against damage too. Plus, even if you did want an Earthshaker cannon, there's better options in Forge World. The Armageddon Basilisk is cheaper than this with the same gun profile, and the Earthshaker carriage is both cheaper with the same gun profile and can get the take aim order, which is pretty outstanding. For artillery in general as well, the Expert Bombardiers trait is kind of okay, but a bit of a side grade on the damage output that you get from Born Soldiers anyway. Most lists don't tend to run super artillery heavy, and it does require the positioning of other units, so it does feel like the overall proposition is just a bit weaker. Overall, I wouldn't say that guard artillery is unusable, but the Basilisk maybe just doesn't seem the best option compared with the competitors. I'd rank it a 6 out of 10 overall. Next up, and perhaps one of its main competitors, is the Manticore, also 140 points, And rather than the Basilisk's strength 10 AP3, this one gets strength 9 and AP2, but a big damage of 3, making it better against harder heavy things. For the most part, I generally consider it to be superior to the Basilisk for that reason. I think that the damage profile is just in its favour, though admittedly you are losing that last turn of damage due to just 4 rockets, so it's perhaps kind of similar there. Overall, I've chosen to rank it a 6 out of 10, the same as the Basilisk, some positives and negatives, maybe just a little bit behind the Bombast field guns in terms of being general purpose though. The Manticore perhaps has a bit of a niche with ignores line of sight on toughness 8 targets and things, but for the most part it probably doesn't have quite enough damage to properly kill those anyway. Finally, for the artillery section, we've got the field ordnance batteries, 130 points for a squad, and you get the option of the rockets, the bombast field gun, or the heavy las cannon. I would probably rate the bombast field gun as the most interesting option. With take aim, I'd argue it probably has the best stats breakdown compared with the Manticore and the Basilisk, only really solidly behind against toughness 8 targets when you've factored in take aim into account, and a couple of these sat on a home objective seems pretty reasonable. For the other loadouts, I think the heavy las cannons are pretty usable as well. Big damage D3 plus 3 anti-armor at a long range. If you are using direct fire though, I feel like they're probably outclassed by the Russes. Their damage output is fine, but their durability is definitely a lot less than the tanks, and they're not as fast either. They also can't fire in melee, so are a bit more vulnerable to combat, and I certainly think that the missiles are a touch lackluster. Overall, I'd rate them a 7 out of 10 for their stronger loadouts, lower than that for their missile battery. Lastly, for the heavy support, we've got their smaller, more traditional cousins, the standard heavy weapon teams, 55 points for a unit of 3 of them, and basically have fairly strong firepower for the cost, particularly with take aim, but absolutely flimsy defense with only 2 wounds at toughness 3. As a result, for the heavy weapon teams, I would basically rank the mortars far higher than the rest of them. They can sit out of line of sight and use their good damage outputs without fear of retribution most of the time, not unless the opponent has their own decent ignores line of sight firepower or extreme fast movers to get round to find them. It does seem to be a fairly common competitive include to have a few mortar squads sat at the back with an officer, maybe Creed for the +1 strength, and then for each unit you get to throw out 3d6 strength 6 AP-1 hits, hitting on 3s before the ignores line of sight debuff comes into effect, and getting a fairly decent damage increase as well from born soldiers. If you're using that, you are likely to get a few 6s. For just something like 110 or 165 points, you are going to be stacking really quite an impressive amount of wounds out of line of sight. Some armies will definitely care about it a lot more than others, but certainly for an anti-light infantry element of your army, they are very strong for that. Certain armies like Eldar and Harlequins just really won't get on with these guys whatsoever. For downsides, if you are playing something like Custodes with 2+ armor saves, it's probably not going to have quite as good an effect. As mentioned, the direct fire weapons are kind of horrible if you have to put them in line of sight, as they get removed very quickly by any sort of guns. And if you do need rerolls, orders, and inflexible command points, you might need a babysitting officer for them, though admittedly those officers could probably be doing other things at the same time. Overall though, I do think that mortar teams really are quite effective. Maybe not all to include good, but certainly a strong part of a lot of competitive lists. I've chosen to rank them a 9 out of 10 overall here. Moving into the elite section of the army, and first up we have the Cadian Kazakin. 100 points per unit base, and you get any special weapons thrown in free. And arguably these guys are perhaps the best infantry damage dealers in the entire codex. Fairly solid damage output in the first place, plus some really nice tricks both to get them exactly where they need to be, and give them massively more damage than you might expect. They're a core unit, have the regiment and platoon keywords, all good things. It means that you can throw on things like Take Aim and Lord Solar rerolls if you want to. Plus they can be affected by that finial standard to ignore modifiers. They've got some excellent supporting stratagems, including one for extra AP and one for mortal wounds on 6s, something that could combine very nicely with ingrained precision from born soldiers. Each unit gets a bonus doctrine as well, which could be handy for, say, ignoring cover at range, or the mechanized one to get out of transports. They're a great choice for that Barbican's Key relic, the one that allows you to teleport around the board. You can get ordered and buffed with rerolls, and then jump off elsewhere to deal some major damage. And just overall, they are a very common competitive include in Astra Militarum lists at the moment. As for downsides, they really aren't all that tough for the cost. 10 points for toughness 3 with a 4+ save isn't all that great with the dangerous weapons of 9th edition. Plus they kind of are a unit that usually needs some way to deliver them. Foot slogging them isn't awful with order support plus rerolls, but things like transports or that Barbican's Key are perhaps preferable. Still though, I have chosen to rank them the full 10 out of 10. They are an incredibly strong unit, and not hard to see why they get played quite so much with the sheer amount of damage that they can do with a bit of support. For perhaps their main rivals within the Guard Infantry Elite, we have the Tempestus Scions, 11 points per model, and do have a few advantages and disadvantages over the Kazakin, though I'd say for the vast majority of purposes, unfortunately, the pros are outweighed by the cons. The units do have a lot of similarities with their decent AP hotshot lasguns, and they do have the core and platoon special rules, which do give them good damage, but they lack regimental, so you're not getting born soldiers, kind of annoying as that is very useful for them. I guess they trade it for their exploding sixes to hit, so that is a different flavour of damage boost, I guess. And while they might be a bit more expensive than the Kazakin, they do have their own advantages. Deep striking if needed, the option to be objective secured if you take them in their own detachment, and good Scion Warlord traits to support them. Some nice shooting buffs, plus potentially that refractor field if you want to give them a 5+ invul. For disadvantages, kind of similar to the Kazakin for the most part, it is a bit disappointing that their deep strike doesn't work with orders and things. If you deep strike some squads of Scions alongside a Tempestor, then you're not going to be able to get them orders, and that does feel like a bit of a rules oversight on GW's part. I feel like they'd probably get more of a look in if Kazakin weren't quite so good, but between the regimental thing, their extra doctrine, their hotshot sniper, and a few other advantages, Kazakin do seem to be the way that most people are going. For that reason, I'd rank the Scions a 7 out of 10, definitely not unusable, but a bit more niche. Next up, we've got a few flavours of Auxilia. We've got the Ogrins at 30 points per model, chunky abhuman ogre people that have at least some ranged and melee threats with their damage to Ripper guns and their knives in combat. They've got a rule that allows them to fire their Ripper guns in melee as if they were vehicles. They're reasonably chunky at toughness 5, 3 wounds and -1 damage, but don't really have any sort of good save, and you can order them with a commissar for things like objective secured if you want to. As for downsides though, it maybe just seems that they're just lacking a little bit of raw strength to propel them into most army lists. The shooting and combat damage output is both kind of okay but not standout, and even their durability, while being alright, isn't amazing considering that they will be damaged quite effectively both by anti-tank and anti-infantry weapons, usually a bad thing. They also aren't core for rerolls and can't get the vast majority of other regular orders, both are things that would have helped them quite a bit. I'd say out of the Auxilia units, the Ogrin are pretty much outcompeted by the Bullgrin, a bit more combat focused and with much better saves, so they're actually quite tanky. Overall, I'd rate the Ogrins a 5 out of 10, fairly underwhelming still, though admittedly a lot better than they were in the previous codex. Moving on to the up-armoured Bullgrin, they're also 30 points per model, though they're 35 with the Mauls, which I would take. It actually makes them one of the more convincing guard melee units, with 5 attacks on the charge, strength 7, AP -1 and 2 damage. It's not a profile that everything's going to care too much about, but that's going to be a decent volume of attacks out of a reasonable unit, I guess. Perhaps their biggest advantages is they are just genuinely quite tanky. They've got the same T5 -1 damage profile as the Ogrins, but actually good saves with them, either the choice of the 4+ invul for the brute shield, or the 2+ armour from the slab shield, which works quite nice with light cover. Again, a commissar seems usable enough for objective secured when they need it, and if you can convince Lord Solar to give them an order rather than hang around with something else, then they will particularly like the fixed bayonets order for the +1 to hit in combat and extra AP. It really turns them into an okay to fairly potent melee threat. For downsides, they're perhaps kind of slow and hard to bring to bear. If the opponent doesn't want units charged by them, it might be kind of hard for them to catch up. Again, not core, can't get most orders and rerolls, and melee isn't particularly general purpose if it runs into -1 damage things like, say, dreadnoughts. Overall, I'd rank them a 7 out of 10, solidly usable, but maybe not enormously stand out within the roster. Lastly, for the abhumans, we've got the Rattlings, 50 points for a squad of these diminutive snipers. Overall, I think they're kind of usable for a forward deployment nuisance threat, starting on objectives in the midfield, and perhaps ideally hiding on one that the opponent isn't going to threaten too much, hopefully pinging in and out of cover, firing off a bunch of sniper shots, and then retreating behind the cover again with their move shoot move rule. Their survivability really is very bad though if the opponent catches up with them. Bad saves and toughness too don't do great, though I guess they do get a little bit of a durability boost in cover with naturally stealthy, and the small profile is quite easy to hide in terms of line of sight purposes. For their downsides, I'd say that their sniper rifle damage is kind of merely okay, particularly if you move shoot moving and suffering the heavy weapon penalty. If the enemy does try and catch up with them, even light infantry are just going to kill them dead in close combat. And if you did want forward deploy things, then Sentinels are kind of tempting as well. Only 40 points for a genuinely quite tanky vehicle to put on objectives in the midfield is interesting. I think there's a fair chance a bunch of people will probably choose those instead. I certainly wouldn't go too heavy on the Rattlings, but I feel like they're usable enough for a 50-point throwaway unit to do a bit of annoying sniper things with move, shoot, move. I'd rank them a 7 out of 10 overall. Finally, for the elite squads, I feel like a unit that's rarely ever going to get taken for the Imperial Guard are Munitorum Servitors, 40 points for a squad, and their only real strength in my opinion is the fact that they're the cheapest infantry unit you can field, so could potentially help out with sitting on objectives or doing sacrificial screening work. In reality though, I think that maybe saving the extra 5 or 10 points over other units just really isn't worth it. Their damage and defense is just spectacularly bad for the cost, even if their tech priest is nearby. If you buy any heavy weapons, you're paying through the nose for them for their mediocre damage output. They don't get any synergies or anything, and there's just a few units that you might directly compare them to for a super cheap unit that just seem flat out better. For an extra 15 points you'll get a mortar heavy weapon team, which seems far better to park on objectives. For the same cost you could have a scout sentinel, which could forward deploy and actually has a reasonable gun and good toughness. Or again, you could have rattlings for another 10 points. Forward deploy and move shoot move seem preferable to these guys. I guess theoretically not entirely useless, but with their current datasheet I can't see a fat lot of people choosing to run these. I've chosen to rank them a 2 out of 10 overall, just as weak as other factions servitors, but costing far more. Moving on, we've got Elite's Choice characters, and first up we have the Commissar, a pretty solid and interesting 40 points guard character, basically bringing you two things in the flexible Commissar Prefectus orders, plus also mitigation for morale as well. Their summary execution means that you can auto-pass combat attrition for one squad, presumably as a panicking guardsman gets blammed. I do quite like what they've done with the Prefectus orders. They aren't generally perhaps the most mainline orders that you want to use every turn, like the regimental ones giving you extra damage or speed, but in the right circumstances they're absolutely great. Objective secured just popping up on a unit is excellent. Falling back and shooting can be great to get your units out of a pinch. The big deep strike denial one could be brutal against armies like demons or Genestealer cult, and there's one for mortal wound protection that could really mess with Grey Knights and Thousand Suns. They have some other pretty interesting options as well, such as taking a Warlord's trait to allow you to access tank orders for a very cheap option for them on one little model. And for his main set of orders you can issue those to Auxilia and Officers. Auxilia perhaps particularly interesting for objective secured Bulgarin perhaps, and he could do interesting things with orders and a big tanky command squad with an Ogrin bodyguard. They're kind of easy to field as well. Arcs of Omen make characters easy to put on the board, plus you can fill them slotless with officers too. As for downsides, the orders aren't usually generally as useful as the standard regimental ones. I feel like they're usually going to be your defaults, where these are going to be the ones that you flex to when you need them. And even then, he might be in a slightly wrong positioning to get those orders off on the units that they need to. He only has a 6-inch range for casting those orders. Like most guard characters, he's got pretty bad damage and defense, and whether or not morale matters is kind of dependent on what army you're running, and maybe what sort of matchup the opponent's playing as well. Some units might just be killing your squads wholesale. Still though, overall I'd certainly rank him a competitive choice. I've ranked him an 8 out of 10 here. I could have easily given him a 9. For other regimental support characters, first up we have the Engineer. He's 40 points as well, and is a bit more focused in his buffs, just grants a 5+ invul save to a vehicle, and repairs D3 wounds per turn as well. A fairly simple value proposition. He has a little bit of damage in his own right, but not much. I feel like it's perfectly reasonable to include one of alongside a tank line, but not mandatory. In theory land, if he manages to use his repair D3 wounds twice, then I guess that theoretically makes back his points cost in terms of additional wounds of rust regenerators, and if any of them ever happen to make an invul save based on that 5+ save, then that's further added value. Overall, I would just rate him a bit take or leave though. He doesn't add an enormous amount, and he might struggle to keep up with tanks a bit, having far less movement than they do. Overall, I'd rank him a 7 out of 10, definitely usable but not standout. Much worse than him, we have the Regimental Preacher, 40 points per model, and a unit that I just don't think that they got right. He casts a prayer which gives a single unit either a 6+ invul save or reroll hits in melee, which might not be too terrible in other armies, but guard armies have kind of limited targets for them. I guess theoretically the buff's probably strongest on units like Rough Riders. They do actually have decent melee plus are core, but I feel like his big issue is that he only ever casts the buff on a 3+. On the turn when you're just about to charge into the enemy and do some major damage, it has a 1 in 3 chance of letting you down, which is kind of depressingly high for 40 points. It just means that it might well have been worth putting the extra few points towards more cost in melee units if he really wanted better melee, and just not bothering with the priest at all. If Rough Riders are moving fast as well, he might well struggle to keep up with them. Again, not particularly helpful. Overall, I think he's not unusable if you're using multiple squads of rough riders, but realistically I just don't think he's worth the 40 points and very few lists are going to take him. I've chosen to rank him a 3 out of 10 here. Finally, for the Elite's character section, we've got a couple of different Catachan characters. First up, Sergeant Harker for 40 points, and in general I'd sum him up as a character that's actually kinda decent for that cost, but held back by the power of the Catachan Infantry Squad datasheet. For 40 points he gets to blaze away with a heavy bolter with Assault 3 and AP-2. It's really not too bad a profile on a character protected gun. You should be getting multiple turns of shooting out of that thing. And otherwise his main value is in buffing Catachan jungle fighters. He gets to issue a single order per turn to them, and then also pre-game you get to select one unit of them, and they get to reroll hit rolls of 1. I think between the gun and those two different flavours of buffs, that's actually really quite good for 40 points, and he's even just a little bit harder to kill than average with a 5+ feel no pain type save. However, I think he is just a bit hamstrung by the fact that most lists just don't really want to run those Catachan jungle fighters. They are pretty much directly worse than the Cadians, and I feel at best Harker just lets them catch up a bit as opposed to really get ahead. If you wanted to make an argument for fielding Catachan jungle fighters, then this guy's probably your best bet. Perhaps him leading 1 or 2 units down a flank really could do you worse. Realistically though, he's just not going to get taken very much if the Catachan jungle fighters aren't. I've ranked him a 6 out of 10 overall. Lastly, for the Elite's characters, we have Sly Marbo himself, the man, the meme, and the legend. He's an Elite's choice character that strikes from the shadows for 50 points, and I think he's really quite an interesting little disruption piece, who's an interesting addition to an army, a kind of interesting thing that can slot into just about any force, but maybe isn't necessarily mandatory in any of them. Typically, he'll pop up, have a good chance of offing some light infantry, or maybe even sniping a character if he's lucky with that Ripper pistol. And then I think the usual idea would either be to charge something light that he can actually kill, and then fade back into the shadows, or just disappear back into the shadows to do it again turn 3, at which points he has to stay on the board. He is very fragile to enemies killing him in return, but if they have to charge him then he can actually potentially pack a punch with that Melter Mine. If he's in cover, he's got a pretty good chance of getting 2d3 mortal wounds on a charging enemy, which is kind of scary. He does happen to have Platoon and Regimental as well for opportunistic buffs, or Born Soldiers for the Ripper pistol. As for downsides, he's got kind of limited value against the tougher enemies out there. Things like Custodes or Imperial Knights he's just not going to be very efficient against, and it could be argued that he contributes to the game a bit later than you'd ideally like, just a bit of damage on turn 2 and turn 3. He's got the potential to be screened out, though that itself might be okay to mess with the opponent's movement in the first place, I guess, and if he wants to charge it is a touch on the unreliable side, even with his reroll. Overall though, I'd rank him a 7 out of 10, decently usable, but definitely not auto-include. He's generally going to have most value against armies with expensive lighter infantry. Fast attack next, and we're on to the trusty Sentinels. These guys are 40 points base for the Scout or 45 for the armoured version, and both do seem really very good within the Guard Codex right now. At least fairly fast compared with most units, very tough for the cost for both variants, particularly the armoured one, and while their damage output is pretty mediocre, they are perhaps one of the most easily buffed units in the entire book. They're core for the rerolls and are pretty nice being able to get both vehicle and infantry orders as you need them. I feel like Games Workshop has actually managed to keep the two variants pretty well balanced as well. The Scout one might be easier to kill with its 4+ save, but it's also cheaper, gets forward deploy, and a movement buff as well. All very good things, and I think that they're both quite balanced. In general, I consider the Plasma Cannon perhaps the most general purpose weapon that they can use, though others can have their advantages, maybe adding on a Hunter Killer Missile if you're going to be investing in them some big rerolls like Lord Solar, or multiple core rolls. And the Sentinel Chainsaw is actually quite a decent melee punch for the extra 5 points, particularly for a unit that's likely going to be skirmishing on the front lines with the enemy. As mentioned, for these guys, the damage output is pretty low, which is their major weakness. You probably wouldn't want to have them as your entire battle line. Scout Sentinels for deploying onto objectives are quite nice, but can mean you lose some points for inflexible command, and individual ones moving forward have the potential to be wrapped and trapped, which could be kind of annoying if you can't fall back from your opponent without spending a bunch of CP. They're also maybe not particularly likely to contest objectives well if the opponent gets any sort of infantry on them. They don't have objectives secured and usually counter just the one model unless you've got the armoured superiority regiments, but just having something tough to put on the objective in the first place is definitely no bad thing. Overall, I think Sentinels are very solid, probably the strongest choice in the fast attack section, and I'd rank them a 9 out of 10 overall. Moving on, we've got the Hellhound, 110 points worth of flame tank, and you can trade out the big Inferno cannon for the Devil Dog's melter cannon and the Bane Wolf's chem cannon. The vehicle's fairly fast, you've got a whole bunch of auto-hitting attacks from two of the variants, quite good against light infantry, and having auto-hitting weapons is nice for things like Overwatch or firing into melee. The Devil Dog has somewhat comparable numbers with the Lehman Russ Demolisher, particularly if you get into melter range, obviously though a bit less damage and defense due to it costing less. Overall though, the general consensus seems to be that these guys are fairly solidly outcompeted by the Lehman Russes, plus within their slot, Sentinels are pretty excellent and can tend to hog the fast attack selections a bit. Having a 5+ chance to explode also can be a bit not ideal. You either need to keep it to the edge of your forces, or risk it throwing a bunch of mortal wounds all over you. Overall, I'd rank them a 6 out of 10, not standout but not terrible. Lastly, for the fast attack, we've got the Rough Riders, 20 points per model in units of 5, and kind of an interesting unit for the guard as they're a fast melee unit that actually has some pretty outstanding melee damage. Certainly makes them very notable in an army that's almost entirely focused around shooting and gun lines. If they can get the charge on something, then they're really quite likely to have the chance to make back their points in a single combat attack, really quite good. And they are quite an easy unit to buff as well, both having core, platoon and regimental for things like orders like fixed bayonets or potentially rerolls. With Lord Solar rerolls, they have the potential to take down an entire Imperial Knight in a single round of combat. They do have a couple of rather big downsides though. They are just very easy to kill for the points cost. Things like heavy bolters will absolutely demolish them, no questions asked. And their cavalry keyword really does put the damper on them getting into combat a bit. It means that you might have to be moving them all the way around the outside of ruins and things, as opposed to say jump infantry, which will be able to jump straight over. Bigger units of them are kind of hard to hide as well. It means that people almost always want to field them in small squads of 5 as their damage output is kind of adequate. I'd be tempted to use maybe 1 or 2 small units hidden quite carefully behind terrain and just have them as a potential scary countercharge threat if the enemy gets too bold. For that reason, I'd rank them an 8 out of 10. I think that they can be competitive, though only in small numbers. If I was feeling a bit less generous, they could have been a 7 perhaps. Transport's next, and first up we have the Chimera, the workhorse of the guard with its lasgun arrays. I feel like it's fairly well balanced with the Taurox if you want a transport to get guardsmen to the front lines, and it is really quite usable either with cheap troops for objectives or Kazakin to get those scary special weapons into the enemy. You can potentially get orders on the unit that disembarks with an officer, plus it's a command vehicle as well, so any embarked officers can issue orders from within it. Really quite nice for any embarked Cadian Castellans, for example. As transports go, its volume fire isn't too bad, decent anti-infantry fire out of the turret, weapon and hull, and compared with the Taurox it does feel like the slightly more premium transport, slightly more toughness, more transport capacity, and that mobile command vehicle thing. Then when it drops its troops off, it can just be an annoying unit to park on objectives or do nuisance charges with. Obviously it's not all good stuff, you could be taking more infantry if you don't run transports, but I think they're efficient enough to just about make the cut. Their damage output isn't super exciting, not compared with tanks, and even with the Chimera's really quite good special rules, orders are still a little bit awkward with embarked units. Compared with the Taurox as well, it's both a bit more expensive and a bit slower as well, so that might outcompete it for certain roles. Overall though, definitely usable, I'd rank an 8 out of 10. Talking of the Taurox, this one's 70 points and has a similar role to the Chimera. It only has toughness 6, but it gets a big 14-inch move and comes armed with a pair of autocannons base. Compared with the Chimera, the reasons to run one are that it's faster, is cheaper, and gets some armoured tracks for a +1 save against damage 1 weapons. Overall, there's positives and trade-offs. It doesn't get a bunch of the luxury things that the Chimera gets, and I'd probably say for the points the Chimera perhaps noses into the lead for me for that reason. The orders rule, the firepower, plus the extra toughness, I think all have their part. Still though, a fairly well balanced alternative depending on exactly what you want. I've chosen to rank it an 8 out of 10 here, could have maybe been persuaded to put it down to a 7. Lastly for the transports, we've got the Taurox Prime, 105 points per model this one, and this guy's the Scion transport, being just as easy to kill as a regular Taurox, so not great on the defensive front for the cost there, but it does come with a lot heavier firepower, hitting on 3s and the choice of a few dangerous top guns, potentially the Gatling cannon for a whole bunch of shots. For the role of transporting Scions into battle, it does seem to be the way to go over Valkyries now. I think there would have been positives to both before the aircraft rules got changed. As for downsides, I do find it a bit sad that it neither gets the regimental keyword for born soldiers and also doesn't get the Scion exploding 6s rule either. I feel like it probably should have got the latter if not the first. And just overall in the Guard army, I generally rate Kazakin in transports over Scions in transports for a few different reasons as mentioned earlier. Overall, when putting everything together, I just don't feel like it's enormously efficient as a value proposition. I'd score it a 6 out of 10 overall, though probably kind of necessary if you do want to try and make a Scion list work. While we're on transports, I thought we'd cover the Guard flyer choice in the Valkyrie, 140 points, and compared with a whole bunch of flyers, this thing did have really quite a lot going for it, though Games Workshop really hasn't been kind to it with the aircraft nerf. The damage output I'd say is actually fairly good for a transport, a whole bunch of heavy bolters and rocket pods hitting on 3s. When it gets on the board it's very fast, zipping around and getting lines of sight where it needs to, and it has that really cool grab shoot insertion rule where you get to move it and then get the squad out, effectively shunting a dangerous unit like some Scions or Kazakin to exactly where they need to be on the board. It's also somewhat tough as well, 14 wounds and -1 to hit isn't too terrible, definitely needs a little bit of focus firepower to bring one down. As for downsides for this thing though, Games Workshop really did mess up the transport rules for it with flyers. With the balanced data slate, they made flyers have to start in strategic reserve, so off the board. That means that this thing only comes down at turn 2 on the earliest, and it can't get any units out when it does so it means that the first time you're disembarking anything from a Valkyrie is turn 3, rather than the previous turn 1. This really is an absolutely massive blow to the Valkyrie's main purpose, and even though it's got good enough damage for a transport, it's pretty mediocre compared with other units. Plus flyers aren't going to help with most objectives. I really feel that the Valkyrie was caught by unnecessary nerfs which were aimed at other flyers, not it, and it means that it's just kind of rubbish in the Guard at the moment. I rank it a 4 out of 10. I think it'd be an interesting niche choice if it could start on the board once more. Next up we've got the big bad Codex Lord of War in the various Baneblade variants. I thought it made more sense to cover them all together rather than individual datasheets, as broadly they're the same profile, plus or minus a different gun and some different transport capacity. In general these big tanks are pretty expensive, the standard Baneblades around about 470 points, some are a bit more and some are a bit less, and numbers wise from a previous damage comparison video, these guys do seem to be on a fairly level playing field with Russes and Rogor Dawns, at least point for point and damage, though compared with the more battle line tanks, I feel like the Baneblades have a couple of little extra bonuses, but then do have some pretty serious weaknesses as well. On the positive side, they are a big focal unit that's really quite efficient for certain buffs, say for example that 5+ invul save from the Tech Priest Engine Seer or a Primaris Psyker. Quite nice for stratagems as well, like smoke launchers. 1 command point for -1 to hit on such a tanky model is pretty big. It's quite nice to see a couple of the previous disadvantages have been removed. They're command point free in Arcs of Omen, unlike some previous editions, and they actually get the regimental traits for once as well. Born Soldiers is pretty nice on all the heavy bolter profiles a lot of these have, so that's quite nice. There's something to be said for concentrating literally all of your durability in one big mass as well. A lot of armies just might not have the raw firepower to bring down a toughness 9 vehicle with a 2+ save and something like 28 to 30 wounds, and they might go down the route of trying to kill just about everything else in your army before finally trying to tackle the Baneblade if they can. The melee of the tank is actually kind of scary with Crush Them if you can spare a command point for that, a bunch of damage to attacks, and Titanic units can perhaps afford to be a little bit more bold than the other tanks as well as having a bit of melee threats. They can also fall back and shoot as well, just by the core rules for Titanic models. There's a couple of interesting tank ace upgrades for them. Vaunted Praetorian could be nice enough, and you could get the Ignores cover one. And out of the individual variants, I feel like you could make arguments for a whole bunch of them. Perhaps some of the most interesting ones might be the Storm Sword, Shadow Sword, Baneblade and Bane Sword. Most of those are pretty general purpose main guns, and the Shadow Sword is just extra good at killing enemy super heavies. A few of the variants come with a big transport capacity as well. That is interesting enough if you did want to deliver some infantry to the front line. For all the positives though, there are some major downsides. Super heavies kind of hate terrain, they can't hide behind obscuring terrain unless it physically blocks line of sight, and they can't make use of dense cover either, 2 major downsides to not getting shot off the board. The Baneblade chassis is also absolutely enormous as well. You're genuinely going to have places in the board where it just can't move through as it's too big. On terrain dense tables this could be seriously problematic. The damage and defense is kind of similar to Lehman Russes and Rogor Dawns, but it's got far less synergies than them. You can't get tank orders, some other character buffs don't work as well on them, and some stratagems are more expensive, and out of the lineup of the Baneblade chassis, a fair few of them are a bit outclassed. The more anti-infantry Stormlord and Hellhammer just seem to be pretty underwhelming for the cost in this new iteration, and the Banehammer's a bit underwhelming compared with some as well. Overall, I'd rank them as usable but not enormously standout. I feel like in general you're going to do better with a battle line of Russes and Dawns compared with Baneblades, but having one as a focal point of a list I don't think is the worst idea in the world. It will just be far more threatening to certain armies than others though, depending on how much crazy anti-tank you have coming at you. Overall I'd rank them a 7 out of 10. Next up we've got the Aegis Defence Line, a 40 points fortification choice for the Guard. This little eagle pattern wall, it costs 40 points and comes in these sections as you can see here. It does give you a genuinely decent buff to your armor saves over and above what you'd usually get. You can get a +2 to your saves if you have light cover from it rather than just the standard +1. And within the Guard army it's perhaps most interesting on units like Kazakin with their 4+ saves, or even maybe Bulgarin with their 2+ for a turn. They're going to be ridiculously hard to kill with a +2 over their 2+ saves. For any games where you can use things like Space Marine allies as well, it's borderline a little bit overpowered I feel. Anything that's got a good save and is happy just to sit and shoot behind it the entire game long is really going to love this. If you bought one in under your Guard detachment and had some allies, then probably the allies with the higher saves are the ones that you want behind this gun line. As for downsides though, the biggest one is that it just doesn't really work amazingly well rules-wise at the moment. As per standard with fortifications, it has the rule where it can't set up within 3 inches of other terrain pieces. That does limit where you can put it. It kinda needs a proper FAQ so it functions in the first place, as it's listed as area terrain despite it only having that one bit of a footprint around that central area. It is static, so any units that are using it will have to stay put or just forfeit their bonus, and even going up to a 2+ save with Kazakin in cover, it's still not going to make them invulnerable. Finally, for the allied thing, current Arcs of Omen rules prevent most allies. If you are running in that game mode, then it means that that's not going to be relevant, so kills another potential use for it. I feel like this thing could probably do with an FAQ to make it functional, and if it does I think it could be interesting. But currently with all the issues I'd rate it as kind of bad. I've chosen to rank it a 5 out of 10 overall here. HQs and characters next, and first up we'll start with Acadian Castellan, perhaps the core most generic officer model for 50 points. This guy's nice and cheap and effective, 2 regimental orders for 50 points, quite nice and flexible for the units nearby him. Reroll 1s to hit, which is quite nice with core units, particularly Plasmaron Sentinels or Cadian Shock Troops, and you could certainly use him for either babysitting mortars and things or jumping out of transport. Quite nice that he's got quite a low cost. He allows you to use some Cadian stratagems for nearby troops as well, which is useful. For the downsides, he's competing with the command squad, whose Voxcaster can broadcast orders really quite a long distance. They are very useful to have around, and with the recent Forge World rules, they have basically updated the Death Corps Field Marshal to do basically what the Acadian Castellan does better. He gets the rerolls and 2 orders, but only costs 35 points, so you could just save yourself 15 points and take one of those instead. Finally, the commandants do have a limitation. It's only 1 per detachment, so you might have to weigh this guy up against, say, Ursula Creed or Ironhand Strachan. Both of those are pretty usable in their own way as well. Overall though, pretty solid for the cost. I'd rate him a 9 out of 10 overall. Sticking with the orders, and we've got the command squads, 75 points per unit for the Cadian or platoon flavour. If you are running an infantry contingent in the list, then these things are pretty much auto-include. They do add a lot to the army for these points. The Voxcaster allows you to get inflexible command even when your infantry squads are really quite dispersed, which is a big benefit. Plus it means that you can throw out an order really quite a long distance and have it splash over infantry units even while these guys are hiding safe. The standard is basically auto-include for reroll 1s to wound bubble for core units. Could be quite nice on mortars or sentinels as well as infantry. And a lot of lists choose to take the Finial of the Nemradesh first, the relic that allows nearby core units to also ignore modifiers, things like -1 to hit or -1 damage. That really is very potent. The standard can also allow you to get a few more points for the boots on the ground secondary if you are somewhat brave and take the squad to the centre of the board. The bonus special weapons and the combat profile of the officer are all handy as well. You can get the medic for a bit more survivability. I'd say that literally all of the advisors can be used, though I would be kind of tempted to keep the squad cheap myself. The Ogren Bodyguard does make the squad rather tanky, and you've got the potential to resurrect him on the dead for 1 CP. That's really quite a big power play with the medic. The Master of Ordnance is alright if you've got a whole bunch of artillery. The Officer of the Fleet is kind of bad in terms of buffing aircraft, but allows you a really disruptive stratagem to keep strategic reserve units off the board. And Astropaths are rather expensive, but they do allow you a psychic denial and the ability to farm some command points via their action. Overall, they really can bring quite a lot to the board. In terms of weaknesses, I'd say maybe only having 1 order is a bit of a disadvantage compared with commandants. I'd be kind of tempted to run these alongside something else with more orders for a bit more flexibility. They're still pretty weak in terms of damage and defense unless you invest in a pricey Ogrin Bodyguard or Nork, but all of those advisors, if you run multiple, are going to be very expensive, and kind of ruin the efficiency of the unit in the first place. Still though, in terms of value added to an army, a unit of this with the finial standard, buffing perhaps some mortars and sentinels or infantry as they move up, I think is going to be a pretty excellent force multiplier. For that efficiency, I've chosen to rank them a 10 out of 10 overall, basically an auto-include territory for a whole bunch of guard lists. For their counterparts in the Scions, we've got the Tempestus command squad. Broadly speaking, they do a lot of the similar things that the standard command squad does. They cost a bit more at 95 points, but that does net them a few other benefits. The veterans hit on 3s, so better special weapon damage output. They get carapace armor for a little bit more survivability. You can take a command rod to give yourself the option of the commissar style orders if they make more sense in the given situation, and perhaps one of the single biggest draws to running the unit are that the Scion warlord traits really are quite good. Multiple options for big direct damage increases. You could easily have 2 of these squads running side by side, buffing a whole ton of Scions, 2 of the shooty warlord traits, the refractor field and the finial standard, and you've got a pretty scary death ball of Scion special weapons there. The squad's also kind of necessary if you want to run a pure Scion detachment and make them objective secured. As for downsides, perhaps one of the most annoying things is that their orders don't work if they deep strike in, which perhaps puts them at slightly cross purposes. They are a bit more expensive for regular command squads without doing a crazy amount more, and just in general, Scions within the Guard Codex are okay, but perhaps outcompeted by Kazakin, again perhaps blunting the effectiveness of things that solely buff Scions. Still though, got a few issues, but they're solid enough. I'd rank them a 7 out of 10 overall. Next up, we've got the Primaris Psyker for 60 points for a Guard Psyker with 2 casts. Fairly cheap and effective, he can be a model to do things like psychic actions as well and provide psychic denials, but some of the Guard powers are pretty decent. I'd say perhaps the 2 most obvious picks are Psychic Barrier plus Night Shroud. Psychic Barrier gives you a 5 plus invul, and Night Shroud means that you can't be hit on a 3 or less. Throw both of those on something big and tough and dangerous like perhaps a Rogue or Dawn tank, or even just the single infantry squad that's most likely to take a whole bunch of enemy fire and you want to try and help survive if at all possible. If you had to pick one of those, I'd probably go for Night Shroud out of the 2. You could have your second spell be something like Psychic Maelstrom, which is a fairly decent witchfire. Between that and Smites, you average around about 4 or 5 mortal wounds on your target each turn, which isn't too bad output at all out of a 60-point unit. Overall, I think he can be pretty decent for 60 points, but is maybe in the sort of points area where it's kind of take or leave rather than mandatory auto-include. A nice optional upgrade, but is perhaps a little bit less essential than things like orders. He also would prevent you getting Abhor the Witch as well. That could be a useful secondary against things like Grey Knights or Thousand Sons, and in general he is a guard character with a kind of weak stat line, much the same as most of the others. I've chosen to rank him a 7 out of 10 overall, decently usable, but probably not one of the top choices. Lastly, for the generic HQs, we've got the trusty Tank Commander, 165 points base, or 175 with heavy bolter sponsons. I feel like Games Workshop has done a lot better at getting these guys right in the new codex. You don't just want to spam tank commanders, you're usually going to want one of these for every 2 to 5 Rosses, something in that kind of nature. These guys get most of the advantages of the standard Rosses, really quite good damage and reasonable movement and toughness, and they're the ones that are going to be the primary source of tank orders, throwing out things like extra damage, extra movement, or objective secured when you need it. Their major disadvantage is that they can't be ordered themselves under normal circumstances. You could take the Warlord trait that allows them to do so, I suppose. I feel like if I was buying a command point upgrade for them, though, my first choice would be Gatekeeper, the awesome relic battle cannon that's strength 9 and flat damage 3. In terms of raw damage output, it basically outcompetes any of the other guns. In general, I'd usually take at least one if I was running multiple Rosses, maybe diminishing returns a little bit after the first though, and I would bear in mind that the character keyword can have some issues as well. More points for Assassinate, plus some armies are just better against characters, things like Raven Guard for example. Overall I'd rate a 9 out of 10 or maybe 10 out of 10. Really quite good in terms of raw damage and what he brings to your nearby Leman Russ battle tanks. Moving on, we've got Lord Solar Leontus, 170 points for the Guard Supreme Commander. Games Workshop do seem to have written his rules quite carefully to make him just have good synergy with just about every unit in the codex. Depending on what units he's near, you can give a unit big rerolls to hit and wound if they're core units, or just rerolls to hit if they're battle tanks, which is also great. It's got his passive aura of core units reroll hit rolls and wound rolls of 1, 3 flexible orders that can be any flavour, and you can order officers, auxiliary, and even super heavies. Basically, if you've got a unit in your army, typically it's going to be stronger if it's near him. The 4 rerolls to hit can be quite powerful with Born Soldiers as well. If you use that 1 command point stratagem to auto wound on a 5+, then it means that you're going to be auto-wounding with half your attacks if Lord Solar uses his rerolls on that unit, quite a big deal. Otherwise, for other benefits, he grants a free command point, or the ability to mess around with secondaries if that makes more sense. His Grand Strategist Warlord trait for command point farming is a rather good one, and he's got some okay melee threat as well, and not too bad defense. Definitely more of a buffing piece than a combat character, though he can lend a hand against elite infantry. As for downsides, I'd say in general he's probably going to be worth the points in the vast majority of guard lists. As his buffs are quite so universal, I think it's going to be rare that he doesn't have something to do something interesting with. I guess perhaps his main issue is competing against his weight in other cheap support characters. With cheap guard ones, you could be getting another 3 or 4 minor support characters to see if they could do better than he could. Things like Engineers, Commissars, Castellans, and more. Otherwise, I feel like his biggest weakness is probably the fact that he only has a short order range of 6 inches. Realistically, it means that he's going to be a bit limited to buffing a chunk of the army rather than everyone. Still though, absolutely great value. I've ranked him a 9 out of 10 here. Could have been tempted to put him up to a 10 out of 10, but I'd still say it's probably not absolutely auto-include for every guard list. Otherwise, for named characters, we've got Ursula Creed, 80 points and taking up her father's mantle. She's basically a 30-point upgrade on a regular Cadian Castellan, getting 3 orders rather than 2, and the standard reroll ones to hit. Besides the extra order flexibility, you also get a rather nice strength buff. You can have +1 strength to shooting attacks from orders, which is quite nice for lasguns, mortars, and hotshot lasguns on Kazakin. Her redeployment warlord trait is a rather good one, and she does have an okay shooting attack of herself, 12 inches, firing off those pistols with 4 shots at strength 5, AP 2, and damage 2. If you're desperate, then you've also got the ability to use your command point reroll twice in any one phase. Could be quite powerful if you really need it. If you make heavy use of it though, you will just be chewing through your command points super fast. Again, like the Castellan, maybe one of the main issues is limited range on her orders, and you're trading off the extra bonuses compared with the option of taking your favourite warlord traits and relics. Some of the guard ones are rather good. I basically weigh her up for the extra points versus a cheaper Castellan or even cheaper Deathcore Marshal. She seems perhaps particularly good to use with mortars maybe. Overall for unit efficiency I'd rate 8 out of 10. Next up we've got Ironhand Strachan, 75 points, and again basically a different flavour of upgrade on your standard commandant. He gets the standard 2 orders plus the reroll ones to hit, but basically what you're getting out of him is just massive extra personal melee threat. For the cost he's not just good melee for guard, he's pretty good melee just in general, 6 attacks at strength 6, AP 3 and damage 2, and if you take his warlord trait you get double exploding 6s and +1 to wound on top of that, making him genuinely scary. He backs that up with decent toughness as well, really quite hard to kill, kind of similar to many Space Marine characters, and he also has another little buff for your squads nearby in combat. For weaknesses, I'd say it's kind of similar to Ursula Creed really. Limited order range, can't choose other relics and warlord traits, and again weighing him up versus what Creed can bring, or whether it's really worth paying the extra points over the Castellan and not putting those points towards another battle line unit. Overall, a solidly usable commandant though, I'd rate him an 8 out of 10. Quite nice to have some lurking powerful countercharge within the ranks. Lastly, for the unique character miniatures, we have Gaunt's Ghosts, 120 points as a unique HQ unit, and kind of a fun mixed bag of characters with a bunch of range and melee weapons. We've got an autocannon, a sniper, and a bunch of minor melee specialists, usually quite good at killing light infantry more so than most. You also get some fun buffs for the squad for each surviving member, and Gaunt himself can issue 2 Prefector's orders. If you take the Warlord trait, he can issue them to the unit itself, say for example making them objective secured. They can forward deploy with their camo cloaks, could be interesting to put them on midfield objectives maybe, or perhaps coordinate with sentinels for buffs. And the camo cloaks are rather an interesting protection against long range shooting. You just literally can't fire at them at greater than 18 inches away, and that can help keep them safe from the heaviest guns around. Unfortunately, despite having rather a lot of pretty interesting abilities, I feel like their main downside is that they're quite expensive and just not really all that much of a focus unit. Lots of models that want to do various different things, and beyond the entire ton of special rules, they just don't have enormous damage or defense against anything besides light infantry that the enemy might field. For that reason, I'd say they're probably one of the weaker guard HQs, and I don't think are likely to get picked above most of the rest. I'd rank them a 6 out of 10. Certainly not unusable, but just a bit on the expensive side for what they're likely to bring to the table in most matchups. That's it for the core codex, but I thought seeing as Guard has really quite a big Forge World roster, we'd go through each one briefly. There are at least a few units that I think are fairly solid. Perhaps weirdly at the very top of the tree is the Deathcore Field Marshal. He's just 35 points, and Games Workshop gave him the same rules as the Cadian Castellan, so a reroll ones to hit for core bubble, plus 2 orders. Weirdly, he costs 35 points where the Cadian Castellan costs 50, so if you want to save 15 points, then you basically get a better officer out of him for the most part. His stat line's a bit weaker, and the loss of the Cadian keywords does limit some things, but in general I feel like it's probably worth it to save 15 points. Really quite solid for a commandant. I'd rate him 10 out of 10 for value. Perhaps the biggest issue is that if you wanted to run one of the other commandants within the same detachment, he would prevent you doing that. Otherwise, we've got a Death Score Squadron Commander, basically a single order on a horse. I'd rate them a 7 out of 10, a bit faster but doesn't really add all that much. The Hades Breaching Drill is an 80 points transport that can only deep strike Death Corps engineers. A bit limited in scope, it can have some fun anti-tank melee if you can get it in I suppose, but it does seem that it's pointed at a bit of a premium in my opinion. The Trojan Support Vehicle is an 85 points transport, a small 6 model transport capacity, and the ability to heal a wound and reload a weapon for a nearby vehicle. I suppose could make hunter-killer missiles a bit more viable for a nearby unit if you really wanted one. In reality though, the transport capacity is a bit small for just about any of your units to want to go in it. I've ranked it a 5 out of 10 for that reason. It needed to have a bigger transport capacity, now things like special weapon squads are gone. The Death Corps Combat Engineers are 8 points elite units, with volume fire with their shotguns at strength 4 AP 0. Really quite solid if all you want is close range anti-infantry fire, though in general I feel like Guard are more lacking for things to take out sturdier stuff. Anti-infantry seems to do okay. I think they are a bit sad that they lost the ability to throw mass gas bombs. That was perhaps their standout feature. Then sticking with the Death Corps of Krieg, we've got the Death Riders and the Death Rider Command Squadron. They're perhaps a bit of a counterpoint to the Rough Riders. 20 points a model still, but really quite tough in comparison to them. But rather than having very good melee damage for the points, theirs is absolutely dreadful. I guess not terrible for a durable unit to throw up to an objective, but it is a bit sad that they lack any massively serious combat power. I suppose you can add a little bit back in with fixed bayonets, I guess. I'd rank them a 6 out of 10 overall. Flyers next, and the Guard Flyers weren't particularly great before the Flyer nerf, and they're certainly looking worse after. Transports like the cheap Arvus Lighter got entirely ruined by having to start in strategic reserve. It means you don't get any units out of them till turn 3, which is usually too late, and bombers are kind of similar. Anything with a bomb type rule means that again you won't be able to use it till turn 3, again too late for most games, and the enemy has the chance to shoot it down before you even get to do that. I'd say even the gun planes are pretty underwhelming. None of them have particularly good damage output for the cost. There's 3 different gun planes in the Avenger Strike Fighter, the Thunderbolt, and the Voss Pattern Lightning, all kind of bad damage output. And then there's 2 gunships in the Vendetta gunship and the Vulture gunship with the Punisher cannons. I guess in theory they could get some coordination with the Master of the Fleet, but I still feel underwhelming compared with the Valkyrie as they hit on 4s not 3s. I feel like they're all a little bit more usable than the bombers and the transports due to getting damage out of deep strike, but still they are very overcosted for what they bring. You're probably just better off putting other units in strategic reserve for the beta strike big damage output rather than these. Artillery next, and I'd say that the Forge World choices have a bit more usable stuff here. The Armageddon Basilisk is 130 points, and it's just basically a Basilisk but better. 10 points less for the exact same Earthshaker cannon profile. The only issue is that it lacks the artillery keyword, so it doesn't get certain synergies, but if all you want is just a big gun to sit at the back, this is absolutely fine. I'd rank it a 7 out of 10. Otherwise, we've got the Armageddon Pattern Medusa, D6 shots at strength 10, AP 3 and damage D6 on a tracked platform. Overall, definitely a scary profile, but doesn't really get all that many hits when it's usually going to be hitting on 5s. It outcompetes the other artillery against very heavy armor, but less so against most things. I'd rank it a 6. But then after that, we have both the Earthshaker and the Medusa mounted on an artillery carriage for 120 points each, and these are kind of interesting as they can actually get the take aim order, which means that as well as getting it a decent amount cheaper, you also get to hit on 4s rather than 5s, and don't take the AP nerf barrage deficit as well. Since the latest Guard Forge World update, the Earthshaker carriage really does look like a very efficient artillery piece. When you give it take aim, it's by far the most efficient big gun that the Guard have access to. Perhaps the biggest deal for it though is that if you play any army that's exceptionally fast moving, you might be able to get it charged in your own deployment zone, and being immobile, it can't fall back, so it's a bit of a disaster. Still though, I feel like a unit or 2 of these right at the back of the board does seem pretty handy. Pretty potent, ignores line of sight firepower, and I'd rate it an 8 out of 10 overall. The Medusa carriage perhaps feels like a slightly lackluster version of that. The main gun just isn't quite as efficient, having the D6 random shots. I'd put that down as a 7. The heavy quad launcher perhaps feels like it's in a bit of a middle ground for anti-infantry shots between the mortars and the wyvern. It can get orders like the mortars, but doesn't get quite as many shots per turn, and it does have the disadvantage over both of them that again it's immobile and can't fall back if it gets charged by something. I feel like it's usable enough, probably a little bit more efficient than the wyvern, just literally because you can order it and you can't with the wyvern. I still rate the mortar heavy weapon teams as probably stronger overall though, just for getting more shots for the points. Finally, we've got the heavy mortar battery, which has just got a fairly underwhelming profile and seems far worse than things like basilisks. And the Colossus bombard that's 150 points and is quite dedicated anti-infantry at strength 6. Again, pretty much outcompeted by basilisks and manticores just for being good against tough things and not just medium infantry. Overall, out of the Forge World artillery, the Earthshaker carriage does seem like a bit of a standout choice, provided you can stop it getting charged. For the other Forge World heavy support units, a few of the others are kind of interesting as well. The Cyclops demolition vehicle is a little rolling bomb for 50 points. If you can coordinate to detonate within the range of a couple of enemy units, then you're probably in a win. You get 2d6 strength 9, AP 2 and damage d3 hits within 6 inches on every unit, and that is generally going to be enough damage to justify itself if you can get it twice. However, at 50 points with a chance of getting just gunned down with a straight anti-tank shot or two, I think it's a little bit questionable, plus it will have to go around terrain and things, which means it's not awesome at getting in range of targets. Maybe not too bad as a disruptive countercharge threat though. The Malcador tanks in the heavy support section, I'm afraid, are just kind of Lehman Russes but worse. Kind of disappointing that they didn't give them any turret weapon profiles, and the Lehman Russ gets a 2+ save when these don't. Just on the raw numbers, they lose out big time. I would say that the Valdor Tank Hunter maybe takes that to new extremes as well, vastly more costly, and also just not that amazing with its anti-tank gun. Definitely not worth 335 points. In terms of non-codex battle tanks, I'd say perhaps the Thunderer is one of the most interesting. They're sort of like a slimmed down version of the Lehman Russ Demolisher. You can see one on the bottom right here. Due to the way that they updated the datasheet, the Demolisher cannon that it packs does get the Lehman Russ profile, and it does count as a turret weapon, so you can't even lock it down in combat. It gets a big damage d3 plus 3, will usually hit on 3s, and you get that on a fairly cheap tank chassis that's toughness 8 and only 120 points. Admittedly, it doesn't get the 2+ save though. If you just want a cheap Demolisher cannon that has the same sort of output as the main gun on a Lehman Russ, for 120 points it seems kind of fine, though it does lack some synergies with a lack of the battle tank keyword. Rapier laser destroyers are 85 points for 3 shots of damage d3 plus 3 anti-tank goodness. I feel like overall these guys are just subpar heavy las cannons at the moment though. They don't get orders as they don't have the platoon keyword, and that's a major deficit over the field ordnance batteries that have a kind of similar profile with the las cannons. Finally, technically in the fortification section, we've got the tarantula batteries. They're 45 points base sentry guns, automatic firepower that targets the closest unit, immobile, and their shooting is just kind of lackluster. Not awful, but generally not worth it compared with what you give up by not moving and not having any major synergies. Finally, we get to the Forge World Super Heavies, and perhaps some of the more overcosted things out of any of them. The Great Big Crassus Transport has a kind of similar defensive profile for the points as Lehman Russ's. It doesn't really have any damage but a massive transport capacity. Needs to do a bit more for 240 points in my opinion, but it means that you could transport a lot of units into battle if you wanted. The Macarius tanks seem kind of similar to the Malcadors, basically just compare kind of horribly with a Rogue or Dawn or Lehman Russ tank for the points. Again, kind of a shame that Games Workshop didn't throw them a bone by giving them a turret weapon keyword. The super heavy artillery pieces are perhaps some of the least valuable units in the entire book, I'm afraid. The Minotaur and the Praetor just really aren't worth considering too much compared with things like Basilisks and Manticores. The Minotaur has a twin Earthshaker cannon that, with its profile, is around about the same damage output as a single Basilisk, which is kind of underwhelming for over double the cost. Lastly, the Stormblade is a Baneblade equivalent that's got some partially updated datasheets. Admittedly, it is a decent amount cheaper than most of the rest, but it does lack a bunch of basic things. It doesn't hit on 3s with a turret weapon keyword, as it doesn't get that. It lacks toughness 9 and has less wounds than most. I'd still say it's not awful though, probably the best of the Forge World Super Heavies. So anyway, there we have a whole load of infantry, tanks and artillery. Hope you've enjoyed a bit of a rundown of all the guard units in Codex Astra Militarum and the Imperial Armour Compendium. And as always with these overviews, if you do think I've skimmed over anything, please let me know down in the comments for any reasons that you think some of these might have been underrated or overhyped. As always, I look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I've done similar videos for this for quite a few of the other factions now, and I'm sure we'll have loads more for the Imperial Guard in the future. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that links down in the video description below if you'd like to say thank you or just keep these videos coming in the future. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.